The metal twang of a wire snapping echoed across the empty field like a rifle shot. Seconds later, every floodlight on the ranch roared to life, flooding the morning mist with blinding white beams. 3 men in neon, HOA patrol, vests froze mid-step, squinting as motion-activated cameras whirred to life above them. One of them, Gary, instinctively reached for his pocket flashlight, only to find it useless against the wall of illumination. They weren't expecting resistance. They definitely weren't expecting him. From the far end of the barn, where the light barely touched the shadows, a tall man stepped into view. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He didn't have to. He walked like a man who'd done it all before, many times, on darker soil and far bloodier nights. 3 hours earlier, the ranch had been silent. The only sounds were the soft crunch of frost under hooves and the distant mooing of cattle. The man who owned the ranch, Daniel Reed, was sipping thick black coffee by the kitchen window, his weathered hands wrapped around the mug. His bones ached not from age but from things he never talked about. He had scars older than the boots he wore. He wasn't a sheriff or a politician. He had no social media, no community ties, and no HOA membership. And yet, somehow, the Homeowners Association just couldn't leave him alone. At first, it was noise complaints, ridiculous, considering the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Then came the letters, then the visits. And now, this, a fence cut clean through, in the dark, by men who thought jurisdiction was just a suggestion. Gary had been the loudest of the trio when they rolled up in their white truck with flashing yellow lights and a bumper sticker that said, "Respect the rules or pay the price." His sidekick, Todd, had more gel in his hair than sense in his head. The third one, Kenny, was just there to carry the clipboard and look important. None of them had so much as a badge, but they barked orders like they were state troopers. Gary insisted the fence was illegally placed, despite GPS records, county maps, and common sense saying otherwise. He pointed to a wrinkled paper printout that looked like it had been stolen from a Monopoly board. "This is our territory. You're gonna need to move that back 20 feet. When Daniel didn't reply, just looked at him in that unreadable way, Gary smirked and said, "Didn't catch that. You speak English out here, cowboy?" That was when the first mistake happened. Todd stepped forward with bolt cutters and went for the top wire. The moment the metal gave way, the system Daniel had quietly installed over the past 6 months triggered. Lights flared. Alarms stayed silent. He wasn't trying to wake the county, just letting someone know he was watching. And then he appeared. The HOA patrol didn't know his name. They didn't need to. All they saw was a lean man in a thermal flannel shirt, boots caked with mud, and eyes that didn't blink much. He didn't yell. Didn't run. Just walked forward with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just far enough to let the floodlights cast long shadows behind him. Gary tried to reclaim control. "Sir, we're here on HOA business. You're in violation of community guidelines. Step back." Daniel didn't step. He didn't even twitch. The quiet drew out, long enough for Todd to glance nervously at Kenny, who was now furiously flipping through the clipboard trying to find something, anything, that looked like authority. Then Daniel spoke calm and low, his voice the kind that came from long marches through dangerous places. "You cut my fence. You're on my land. You should leave." It wasn't a threat. It was just the truth, delivered like a weather report. Todd mumbled, "Let's just go. This guy's giving me weird vibes." Gary turned sharply. "We're not done here. I'm not letting some mountain hermit boss me around." That was when the red dot appeared, just for a second, on the hood of their truck. The drone had activated. High above the barn, silent and nearly invisible, a small quadcopter hovered and relayed real-time footage to Daniel's wrist monitor. Gary didn't see it. But Kenny did. "Hey, is that a drone?" Todd followed his gaze, spotted the faint blinking light, and almost dropped his phone. "This guy's got surveillance?" They turned back, but Daniel was already walking away. Not fast. Just done with them. They watched as he disappeared into the barn, leaving behind the cut fence, the humming drone, and a growing realization that they just messed with the wrong man. I told you we should have gone through the board, Kenny whispered. You think this guy's military? Todd asked. He's not military, Gary grunted. He's a nut-job playing soldier. But even he didn't believe it anymore. Inside the barn, Daniel turned off the monitor and poured the rest of his coffee into a tin sink. The world he'd left behind years ago had rules, tough ones, bloody ones, but at least they were clear. Out here, the enemies wore name tags and smiled while they trespassed. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked around the barn, taking in the shelves of tools, the stacked feed, and the shadowed corners where more than one visitor had been foolish enough to poke around. He never wanted to fight again. But some men only understand resistance when it's tactical. The HOA patrol sped away, tires spinning in loose dirt. For now, they'd report back to the board and probably lie about how it went. But Daniel knew they'd be back. People like them didn't stop until someone made them. He walked out to the fence, knelt by the clean cut, and examined the wire. He'd welded it himself. Built that fence by hand. It wasn't about the property line. It was about respect. About people who thought their clipboard meant they owned everything they looked at. He patched it temporarily, just enough for now, and stood in the sunrise haze, watching the dirt road. His land stretched wide behind him, acres of peace he'd earned. But peace didn't come free. And this time, they were going to learn that the hard way. At the center of the HOA's next meeting, Gary slammed his clipboard onto the table, nearly knocking over a stack of sugar packets and a half-empty coffee cup. The board had gathered in a cramped office rented above a frozen yogurt shop, and despite the low ceilings and humming air conditioning, Gary acted like he was running the Pentagon. He didn't even flinch. He growled. Floodlights, drones, and God knows what kind of surveillance setup he's got. This rancher thinks he's running Fort Knox. Marlene, the HOA president, raised a carefully plucked eyebrow. You mean the guy with the barbed wire? That's outside our boundary lines. What were you even doing out there? Gary leaned forward, his voice sharpening. He cut across our expansion zone. It's marked clearly on the adjusted map we submitted. A few members looked uncomfortable. One of them, Barry, flipped open his binder. Those expansion maps aren't approved yet. And even if they were, that ranch is county property. Not HOA governed. Gary waved him off. Technicalities. He's sitting on prime land. Once we bring in the new community garden, we'll need access through that stretch. He's just standing in the way. Todd, sitting in the corner and nursing a bruised ego and possibly a twisted ankle from falling into the mud pit, muttered under his breath. He had cameras on the trees. Like actually hidden in the branches. That's not normal, right? Gary ignored him. We're escalating this. I'll file a formal notice. Interference with future developments. And if that doesn't work, we pressure the county to re-examine his boundary lines. Marlene tapped a pen against her notepad. You're picking a fight with someone who clearly isn't interested in playing games. Gary snorted. He's a hermit. Probably used to barking at coyotes and eating out of tin cans. We apply pressure long enough, he folds. Nobody said it, but several board members had doubts. Gary had a talent for making messes, and this one felt bigger than the rest. Meanwhile, back on the ranch, Daniel was repairing the cut fence properly this time. His hands moved with quiet purpose, twisting the wire, replacing the damaged posts, and resetting the motion sensors along the trail. He didn't need help. He didn't want it. Years ago, in a different world, he'd worked in teams. Coordinated strikes, evacuation routes, silent entries under moonless skies. But this land was different. Here, silence meant peace. The only missions involved cattle feed and making sure coyotes stayed far away. At least, until recently. He'd seen people like those patrol clowns before, just in different uniforms. Loud. Untrained. Armed with paperwork instead of weapons, but the energy was the same. They thought the rules didn't apply. That their noise could overwrite the silence earned by better men. He wasn't about to let them stomp over everything he'd built. That evening, a county official knocked at his gate. Daniel saw the truck before it pulled in and waited quietly, arms crossed. The man who stepped out looked nervous, carrying a clipboard and a hat too big for his head. "Mr. Reed?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "We received a complaint," the man continued. "Something about unauthorized fencing on shared property lines." Daniel didn't move. "Shared with who?" The official hesitated. "Homeowners Association claim. They're alleging you've extended your fence into projected development zones. I'm not saying it's true, just that we have to file a response." Daniel motioned for the man to follow, and led him to the barn. Inside, under a dusty tarp, he pulled out a heavy storage case, unlocked it, and retrieved a file folder with original land deeds, GPS data, topographical maps, and surveyor signatures. Every document was dated, notarized, and stamped. The official's eyes widened. "This is meticulous," Daniel replied. "I don't fence a line unless I've walked it myself." He wasn't trying to impress. He was just making it clear, this wasn't his first territory dispute. The official took the documents, promised to file a response, and turned to leave. Before he climbed into his truck, he paused. "You served?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Retired." The man gave a short nod, like that explained everything. "I'll be honest," he said. "That HOA's getting aggressive with their land pushes. You're not the only one they've been hassling, just the only one who hasn't folded." Daniel offered no sympathy, just a quiet truth. "They cut my fence. I don't forget things like that." Back in town, Gary wasn't done. His bruised ego needed fuel, and he found it in the form of an after-hours visit to the ranch with Todd and a hired private security contractor. Not armed, but heavily equipped with flashlights, walkie-talkies, and what they called visual deterrents, which, in reality, were just plastic badges and matching windbreakers. They waited until nightfall and parked on the side of the dirt road, cutting across the tall grass toward the edge of the property where Daniel's newly welded fence glinted in the moonlight. "Disable the cameras," Gary whispered. Todd, nervous, approached a nearby tree but immediately stopped. Something clicked under his foot. He didn't have time to jump back. A hidden sprinkler system blasted him with cold, rancid water that smelled like sulfur and spoiled eggs. He screamed and tripped backward into a shallow trench, again. Gary cursed and swung his flashlight around, spotting a wooden sign half buried in the grass. It read, "Caution, wildlife activity. Enter at risk." Below it, spray-painted crudely, another message had been added. "Fence cutters get the horns." Todd scrambled out of the mud, covered in stink and shaking. Gary looked up toward the barn and spotted a faint red light blink once, then vanish. "We need to go," Todd hissed. "This guy's unhinged." "What if he's armed?" Gary gritted his teeth. "He wouldn't dare. He's just bluffing." But deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. The more they pushed, the calmer the rancher got. And that calm was what made everything feel so wrong. Daniel, watching from his porch in the dark, didn't call the sheriff. Didn't lift a finger. He didn't need to. The cameras caught everything. The signs worked better than any threat. And the smell from those stink sprinklers would cling to Todd for days. He leaned back in his chair and looked out at the land stretching far into the hills. He didn't want trouble. But if they kept knocking, they were going to learn something no HOA meeting ever prepared them for. Peace was something he earned. But keeping it? That took a different kind of training. And he had plenty of that left. The HOA board didn't wait long before making their next move. 3 days after the failed nighttime trespass, Daniel stood on his porch sipping coffee when he saw a line of SUVs crawling up the dirt road like ants seeking food. There were 4 in total, 2 marked with the HOA's custom decals and 2 that appeared to be private security, men in tactical black polos, earpieces, and body armor they had no real reason to wear. Behind them followed a white county vehicle, clearly forced into participation. Gary stepped out first, clipboard in hand, walking with the smug swagger of a man who thought paperwork could override reality. He called out before he was even halfway up the drive. "Mr. Reed!" You are hereby being served a mandatory land access request under Emergency HOA Policy Provision 42B. Daniel said nothing. He just leaned against the post, watching. Another man stepped out of the SUV, an older man in a suit, flanked by two younger security officers. Marlene, the board president, emerged next, heels sinking into the dust, nose turned up like she was smelling livestock she didn't approve of. Behind them all came the county official, same man from before, clearly uncomfortable, holding a folder tight against his chest like it was a riot shield. Gary continued, undeterred by the silence. We're here to conduct an emergency inspection. You've interfered with future community planning. This land may be subject to eminent domain depending on our findings. You will allow us access. The security officers flanked Gary as he stepped forward. Todd, a few feet behind him, looked freshly showered but still smelled faintly of sulfur. Daniel finally spoke calmly. No. Gary blinked. Excuse me? Daniel took a slow step down from the porch. You're not on HOA land. You're on county land. You don't have jurisdiction here. And I didn't authorize this inspection. Marlene stepped in, her voice dripping with false politeness. We have the right to evaluate safety conditions for neighboring developments. Daniel kept his eyes on her. No, you don't. Not without a county order. And not with private contractors pretending to be law enforcement. The county official raised a hand and cleared his throat. Actually, Mr. Reed's right. His documents check out. His fence is legal, his land's outside HOA borders, and there's no existing easement or override for development rights. I only came along because I was told this was a county-sanctioned inquiry. But this isn't. Silence dropped like a bomb. Gary's mouth opened, but no sound came. Marlene's face turned pink, then pale. The suited man tried to speak, but at that moment, 3 black government SUVs pulled up behind the group. No markings. Just matte black paint, government plates, and engines that idled with deep growls. The new arrivals stepped out. Men in clean suits. One of them wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. The leader walked toward Daniel and extended a hand. Colonel Reed. Daniel shook it briefly, then nodded. The man turned to the group behind him. We're with the Office of Federal Land Enforcement. We've received a complaint from Mr. Reed regarding unlawful trespassing and harassment related to improper authority claims over non-HOA property. You are all to remain where you are while we review the situation. Gary immediately tried to deflect. Hold on, this is a misunderstanding. We were just enforcing neighborhood planning protocols. The federal agent pulled out a document from his coat and held it up. There's no protocol that allows a private HOA to use intimidation, private security, and fabricated jurisdiction to pressure legal landowners. You've entered this property under false pretenses. That's a federal offense. Todd stepped back instinctively. Marlene stammered something about legal confusion. The suited man from their side tried to argue about real estate zoning. But then another voice spoke, calmly and sharply, from one of the black SUVs. You're done. The door opened and out stepped a woman in military fatigues, clean boots, and a badge around her neck. She walked directly to Daniel and handed him a document. This is confirmation. We've traced the HOA's submitted development maps. They're falsified. The county wasn't notified. The surveyor they claim to use hasn't worked in 5 years. Your land is safe, and they're being investigated. Gary tried to get into his SUV, but one of the agents moved to block him. You're not going anywhere. There's suspicion of document forgery and use of impersonation to manipulate land boundaries. Daniel didn't say a word. He just watched. Calm. Still. Until Gary turned to him with the last shred of bravado. You think this means anything? You think this makes you untouchable? Daniel finally stepped forward. No. But it makes me exactly as untouchable as I need to be to stop people like you from cutting my fence and threatening my land. Gary opened his mouth again but closed it when he noticed that all the private security guys were now slowly backing toward their vehicles, no longer looking like a unit. They were hired muscle, not idiots. And they knew when the game was over. A few hours later, the SUVs were gone. The agents took copies of all Daniel's paperwork, filed formal complaints, and promised follow-ups. The HOA board members were released pending investigation, but the message was clear. That property line was not to be crossed again. Not physically, and not legally. Daniel stood by the repaired fence as the last vehicle vanished down the road. He placed a new sign on the gate. Simple wording, no threats. Just the truth. Private ranch. No trespassing. HOA-free zone. Surveillance active. It wasn't about scaring people. It was about setting the boundary in stone. This was a man who had once crossed borders under fire. Now he simply wanted his own line respected. A week later, the town was buzzing. Rumors flew, stories grew. Some said he had drones armed with tranquilizer darts. Others swore he had satellite coverage through an old military contract. None of it was true. But Daniel didn't correct them. Let the mystery keep the boardroom cowboys away. That weekend, he hosted a small barbecue for his neighbors. Not many came. Just a few folks he trusted. The food was simple, the beer cold, and the mood easy. A kid wandered near the edge of the barn and spotted one of the old drone units on a shelf. He turned to Daniel. "Were you really a soldier?" Daniel paused, then answered, "I was. Now I'm just someone who likes fences that stay where I put them." As the sun set, a hawk soared above the pastures, casting its shadow over the quiet land. Daniel watched it disappear behind the ridge. There were no more flashing lights. No more shouting visitors. Just the slow creak of a porch chair and the soft chirp of cicadas in the distance. Peace wasn't given. It was built, welded wire by wire, and sometimes defended without raising a single weapon. And this time, the fence held. Ask ChatGPT.